America Civic Compact. Don't want to put any pressure on our two guests, but they're going to wrap it all up and explain it all to us in this final conversation, cultivating our civic vocation and contributing to the common good. I'll introduce them in the order that they will be speaking. They're each going to make opening statements, and then in the second part of this session, the three of us will repair to the chairs and have a bit of a fireside chat without the fireside. And then in the third part, as we have with all the other sessions, we'll have time for Q&A with the audience. Our first speaker is Ian Rowe, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education and upward mobility, family formation, and adoption. He's also the co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, a new network of character-based international baccalaureate high schools that opening in the Bronx in 2022. He's the chairman of the board also of Spence Chapin, a nonprofit adoption services organization, and the co-founder of the National Summer School Initiative. He concurrently serves as a senior visiting fellow at the Woodson Center and a writer for the 1776 Unites campaign. Until 2020, he was the CEO of Public Prep, a nonprofit network of public charter schools based in the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Before that, he was deputy director of post-secondary success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a senior vice president at MTV, director of strategy at USA Freedom Corps office in the White House, and co-founder and president of Third Millennium Media. He also was involved with Teach for America in its early days. He's widely published in a range of American media, and he's working on a book forthcoming called Agency, which seeks to inspire young people of all races to build strong families and become masters of their own destiny. And among the more extraordinary things is that all of this comes from a foundation in his undergraduate days at Cornell in computer science engineering. So there's a thought for all of our undergraduate students. We're delighted that joining Ian is Suzanne Spalding, who's Senior Advisor for Homeland Security and Director of the Defending Democratic Institutions Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She also serves as a member of the Cyberspace Solarian Commission. Previously, she was Undersecretary for the Department of Homeland Security, where she led the National Protections and Programs Directorate, now called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, charged with strengthening cybersecurity and protecting the nation's critical infrastructure, including election infrastructure. Ms. Spalding has served in Republican and Democratic administrations and on both sides of the aisle in Congress. She was general counsel for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and minority staff director for the House of Representatives Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. She also spent 6 years at the CIA as Assistant General Counsel and Legal Advisor to the Director's Non-Proliferation Center. She's also been Executive Director of 2 congressionally created commissions on WMD and on terrorism. And as well, to her service with the federal government after the 9/11 attacks in 2001, she worked with the CEOs from the Business Roundtable, with Governor Mark Warner of Virginia, on securing the Commonwealth, and she's also now a member of the Homeland Security Experts Group. So, Ian, first to the podium. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Ian and Suzanne. Thank you.
Good morning, Paul. Thank you very much for that introduction. As you mentioned, I am a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and in that capacity, I do focus on upward mobility and the factors that normally drive whether a person of any background can be successful. So as a result, I study factors such as family formation, adoption, and education, and certainly while I'm proud of the work that I do at AEI to influence policy or provide testimony to Congress on these issues, or write op-eds and do podcasts. Today I want to focus on the other part of my professional identity. And that is to operationalize the ideas where it really matters, on the ground, in the real world, in K-12 education. As Paul said, for the last 10 years, I was the CEO of Public Prep, a nonprofit network of public charter elementary and middle schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We educated more than 2,000 students, primarily low-income Black and Hispanic students. We had nearly 5,000 families each year who entered the random lottery but did not get in. It's an amazing day when we call families on the day of the lottery to say that your child has won the golden ticket, a seat at our schools. It's heartbreaking when we have to say to nearly 5,000 families that the best we can do is put your child on an excruciatingly long wait list. Many of our parents understood that their kids would face challenges, sometimes as a function of their skin color, zip code, economic status, but they knew that none of these things had to be destiny for their kids, especially if they could receive a good education. These parents were given the power to choose our schools because they wanted their children to develop the skills and habits to become agents of their own uplift and to build a better life, even in the face of structural barriers. In District 8 in the South Bronx, where we're building our schools, of the nearly 2,000 students in traditional public schools who began high school in 9th grade in 2015, 4 years later, only 2% graduated from high school ready for college. That means 98% of students either dropped out of high school before completing their senior year, or they did earn their high school diploma, but still needed remediation in math and reading, even if they did go to college. Sadly, that has been the situation for generations in too many communities across our country. And in too few communities do parents have the power to choose a great school for their child. If we are discussing a crisis in civics or wealth gaps or incarceration rates as adults, we have to start there much, much earlier. Indeed, if such low numbers of kids in this and other districts are graduating from high school, incapable of doing even basic reading and math, why would we reasonably expect these same kids as adults to be flourishing in higher education, the workplace, starting businesses, getting married, having children within marriage, or any of the other behaviors that typically mark passage into young adulthood and likely entry into the middle class or beyond? And as Paul said, that is why I'm going back in. That's why I'm now founding Vertex Partnership Academies, a new network of character-based international baccalaureate high schools, with the first campus to open this August in the Bronx. The school will be organized with 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, wisdom, temperance. Everything will be organized around the core concepts of equality of opportunity, individual dignity, common humanity, and will actually seek to have democratic discourse. In fact, we're hiring teachers now, outstanding teachers. If you're interested, we've made a requirement in our selection process that you have to view one of the debates I did on C-SPAN on critical race theory. I think I won. But that's part of the we want to see how prospective teachers react to what I think is a great example of democratic discourse in a very contentious topic. I say all this because I think it's very important that the civic institutions that we rely upon have to, in fact, embody the very values we espouse. We must be committed to democratic discourse, viewpoint diversity. We must build schools that let kids know that they live in a good, if not great, country, one that is not hostile to their dreams, that the country's journey from good to great is actually very dependent on their active participation. That the embrace of the country's founding principles around faith, family, hard work, free enterprise can be a pathway to their own prosperity. This means teaching a full, accurate history of America, warts and all. The problem I see, though, is that young people are being dissuaded from active participation in strengthening our country and their own lives. It was mentioned earlier, but take, for example, the New York Times 1619 Project. Rather than being empowering, the 1619 Project claims that America's founding principles were, quote, false when they were written, that the country's founding was not even in 1776, that the country was founded as a slavocracy and not a democracy, that the country has anti-black racism running in its very DNA. In general, I think young people of all races today are trapped between two dominant narratives. The first narrative is what I call blame the system, the belief that America is inherently an oppressive nation, that every institution is steeped in racism or sexism, that there is a white supremacist lurking on every corner, that capitalism itself is evil, that these systems are so rigged and discriminatory that the individual is powerless, and only massive government intervention is the solution. The second narrative I call blame the victim. The idea that America is the greatest country in the world, it's full of opportunity, and that if you are not successful, then it must be your fault. You have some pathology that is the cause of your failure. You should have pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps. Both of these narratives are wrong in their own way and rob young people of agency, the sense that they can control their own destiny. I define agency as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. Agency is a vector like velocity, where velocity is not just speed, it is speed and direction. So if agency is free will guided by moral discernment, where does that moral guidance come from? No one is entirely helpless, and no one can truly make it on their own. Agency is individually practiced, but socially empowered. And that's where true civic engagement should play a huge role. If we want to help young people of all races achieve the American dream and renew the civic compact, we have to create a new framework that young people can embrace, that gives them the best shot to counter the paralyzing institutional forces that blame the system advocates constantly cite, while simultaneously providing the kinds of support that young people need to succeed that blame the victim advocates constantly ignore. So I am now proposing a new framework that I call FREE. And it's based on encouraging young people to embrace 4 pillars: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. FREE. A revitalization of the 4 local mediating institutions that drive human flourishing. As Paul mentioned, I do have a book called Agency coming out in May where I go into more detail on what the FREE framework looks like. But FREE, the F in FREE is all about family, not the family that you're from, it's about the family that you form. So family is helping young people understand the importance of forming strong families, the fundamental building block of human society, as young people make decisions on their passageway to young adulthood. Here we would teach decision-making that if, for example, if you finish your education, even just a high school degree, get a full-time job of any kind, just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if you have children, get marriage first. Data shows that 97% of millennials who follow that series of decisions avoid poverty. That's incredible information that young people need to know, especially in communities where that is not the norm. The R in free is religion. And the idea that a personal faith commitment can make a dramatic difference in a young person's life. It's not something we even talk about very much, even in a conference like this, how important the faith commitment is. And young people, not that you have to be Catholic or Buddhist, but the importance of a faith commitment, elevating the role that religion should play in our society generally, as well as in your own personal life. E is for education, ensuring that every parent, as I've talked about, has the right to choose the education that best meets their child's needs. School choice is fundamental. School choice exists for lots of folks in America today, middle and upper class. They can choose to move to a great neighborhood. They can access private school, religious school. But school choice doesn't exist for the very kids that demand it the most. And then the last E is entrepreneurship. How is it that young people access capital and build wealth? It's something we need to make an explicit approach for how young people can become masters of their own destiny. And again, we're happy to go into more detail on how we operationalize each one of the 4 elements of free. I mean, just to give you an example, though, of how the free pillars can intersect and why it's important that young people have information so how they can understand what is possible in their own lives. Consider that according to the federal survey, the 2019 survey of consumer finances, the wealth gap, something that's often referred to very ominously in our country, the wealth gap between black and white Americans at the median, meaning the middle household income in each community, or wealth in each community, the gap was $164,000. For some, this gap is vibrant proof of a permanent and insurmountable legacy of racial discrimination. And as a result, today's public discourse is dominated by the disempowering narrative that unless institutional barriers are removed, Black Americans are trapped in a perpetual cycle of economic victimhood. The Institute for Policy Studies notes that, quote, changes in individual behavior will not close the racial wealth divide. Only structural, systemic policy change can do that, end quote. In What We Get Wrong About Closing the Racial Wealth Gap, Professor William Darity and his colleagues assert that, quote, there are no actions that Black Americans can take unilaterally that will have much of an effect on reducing the racial wealth gap, end quote. New York Times reported Nikole Hannah-Jones in an 8,000-word piece arguing that reparations is the only answer for Black people says, quote, none of the actions we are told Black people must take if they want to lift themselves out of poverty and gain financial stability, not marrying, not getting educated, not saving more, not owning a home, none of those things can mitigate 400 years of racialized plundering, unquote. I run schools. Imagine if you were a 12-year-old Black kid living in the South Bronx with aspirations to work hard, to achieve the American dream, yet you are repeatedly told that there is nothing that you can do individually to achieve the goal. Imagine further that this message comes from adults who claim to advocate on your behalf, and yet they tell you it is pointless to even try, simply because you are Black and have no individual ability to close the racial wealth divide. As someone who has run public charter schools in low-income communities, I know how debilitating such a narrative can be for a student's hopes and aspirations. Rather than helping that young man develop personal agency and an understanding of the behaviors most likely to propel him into success, this message will only teach what psychologists term learned helplessness. And yet, here is the irony. You know that litany that Nikole Hannah-Jones suggested, that not marrying, not educated, not saving more, not owning a home? Based on her biography, she's done all of those things and is leading quite a privileged life. And the thing is, she's not alone. If you look at the same 2019 survey of consumer finances, shows that when just two other factors are taken into account, education and family structure, on an absolute basis, the median net worth of a married, college-educated black household is nearly $220,000. And when you compare that to the typical white single-parent household, which is about $60,000, that $160,000 wealth gap is literally completely reversed. Imagine if our institutions were sending that message of empowerment, of what young people of all races can do, versus the defeatist message of what you cannot. Speaking of institutions, I'll get to my end. Let me close with one of the observations that Alexis de Tocqueville made in 1840 as he observed the United States. He said, quote, "In the United States, as soon as several inhabitants have taken an opinion or an idea they wish to promote in society, they seek each other out and unite together once they have made contact. From that moment, they are no longer isolated, but have become a power seen from afar, whose activities serve as an example, and whose words are heeded. Whose words are heeded." As we lament the civic crisis in our country today, we should not ignore the civic revolution that has happened over the last years and is still happening today. I mean, there's so many organizations that literally did not exist a year or 2 years ago that are having huge impact in our country. You might be familiar with a group called Parents Defending Education that literally just formed a year ago. Last night, they announced that they had won an huge case in Virginia against the school board that had changed the admissions rules for Thomas Jefferson High School, and that the judge ruled that the school had illegally determined, reduced the school standard to effectively discriminate against Asian American students. A huge ruling. Literally, this group didn't exist, but they were created because a group of people came together, primarily parents, because they were frustrated at what they were seeing in their own kids' education. I'm a member of 1776 Unites with the Woodson Center and Bob Woodson. Woodson Center has been around for 40 years, but 1776 Unites has been around for about 2 years. A group of people who came together in response to the New York Times 1619 Project, not to cancel the 1619 Project, but to present an empowering alternative. You don't beat bad ideas by banning them. You beat bad ideas by presenting better ideas. And so that's why we've created, once we saw that 1776 Unites curriculum was now being embraced by schools in Chicago, Buffalo, Newark, some of the worst performing schools in the country, we said, we got to create something better. So we put together a 1776 Unites curriculum, which has now been downloaded more than 25,000 times across the country by teachers in all 50 states, private schools, public schools, charter schools, after schools, home schools, ministries. Because we need to tell the full story of America, warts and all, not sanitized to cleanse all of the negative elements of our country, nor cherry-picked so you only focus on those most egregiously horrific components of our country. Again, 1776 Unites didn't exist 2 years ago. Adam Seagrave is a part of Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. Again, that didn't exist a year ago, I think, Adam. I think it now has 115 chapters because people were frustrated by who are against racism, but not anti-racist, right? And fighting this ideology. And again, it's to provide an empowering alternative. School board members all across the country, all of these examples we should celebrate. While we lament a decline in civics, we should actually recognize that something very positive is happening in our country, where people are coming together in association with each other around common cause. Let me finalize my quote by again quoting de Tocqueville, who said, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults." I've always found that phrase inspiring because it says we're always on a journey together. We haven't gotten it right. We have to strive to continue to get it right. You know, America, like every young person, has embedded within them the tools of self-betterment and self-renewal. To me, if we continue to reinforce that message, we will best cultivate our civic vocation and contribute to the common good. Thank you.
And thank you for that. And thank you, Paul, for the introduction. And thanks to ASU and SCETL for inviting me to be here as part of this conference. I cannot tell you what a treat this has been for me. It is so rare, A, that I get to go and actually sit for a full day and listen to a conference. For years, I have had to run in, make my remarks, run out to the next thing, and wish that I could stay and listen. And it has just been such a delight. And two, it is incredibly rare, in fact, maybe unprecedented, that I get to attend a conference that is not about national security, that is not a room full of practitioners, but is a room full of intellects and scholars who are exploring really nuanced, fundamentally important ideas. So I just cannot thank you enough. It has been a real gift. I have been wondering, what am I doing here? I am not a scholar. I am a practitioner of national security. I am trained as a lawyer. In my career, I have been a national security lawyer and in national security policy positions. And so I bring, as Ian does, a very pragmatic, kind of on the ground, let's tackle this problem. I have had the luxury since January of 2017 to be at a think tank in Washington, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I have had a rare opportunity to do some in-depth research and thinking, and it has led me to this point where I am a passionate advocate for civics education as a national security imperative. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how I came to this and what I'm doing about it now. And I'm going to ask for your help. So I was at the Department of Homeland Security. I led the terrific group of men and women who were focused on protecting our cybersecurity and our critical infrastructure from all hazards, physical and cyber. In 2016, of course, we were very focused on election infrastructure. And when I got out, I thought a lot about the disinformation, the information operations that we had seen there. And that Russia's efforts to interfere in our election were really part of a long-term, broader campaign to undermine the public's faith and confidence in democracy and in democratic institutions. So I thought to myself, I spent years in the intelligence community and doing oversight of the intelligence community, and we do something called red teaming. You try to put yourself in your adversary's head, and it's a scary thing to do if you're trying to put yourself in Putin's head, but I did. I thought to myself, okay, if I were Putin and my objective was to undermine public trust in democracy and its institutions, where would I go next? What other institution, like elections, is so dependent upon the trust of the public in the legitimacy of the process to accept the legitimacy of the outcome, right? And I'm trained as a lawyer, so I immediately thought about our justice system. Right? Think about that, right? It's all based on the public's willingness to accept the legitimacy of those decisions. And I thought that's what I would do. I would undermine the public's trust in the legitimacy of the justice system to wreak havoc, to destabilize democracy. I thought we were getting out ahead of something, but when we started looking at it, we found evidence all over that indeed this has been part of Russia's strategy. And in fact, Eastern European intelligence officers who've been following Putin for decades will tell you that that is one of his strategic objectives, is to undermine trust in the justice system in Eastern and Central Europe and in the United States. So we found lots of examples of Russian fake affinity groups trying to turn out protests in the streets, around court cases, of fake social media accounts, exacerbating. Now, the key to this, to understanding this, is to understand that Putin is taking advantage of weaknesses and vulnerabilities of our own making, right? So picking up on divisive issues, picking up on legitimate grievances, and exacerbating those, pouring gasoline on the flames of divisiveness that engulf, for example, social media already, right? But to drive those wedges deeper. And Russia doesn't typically choose sides. They are happy to play on both sides, whether it's on the immigration issue. We saw that in Garland, Texas, where they tried to turn out people on both sides just to bring chaos and violence into the streets. We see it on the racial justice issue, where they will pop up as a Blue Lives Matter group. They'll pop up as a Black Lives Matter group. They will choose both sides. The idea is to increase divisiveness. So when these kinds of cases come in front of the justice system, it's a perfect opportunity to use those divisive issues to undermine public trust in the justice system. And they use it to convince Americans that the system is not just flawed. I always say my friends who are judicial reform advocates are patriots, right? Those who march in the streets peacefully for racial justice, they are patriots. They are trying to make the system better so that our country will be stronger. That is not Putin's goal. And unfortunately, the narratives that Putin pushes and exacerbates have also are carried and pushed by domestic voices. And that message that is so pernicious is that the system is irrevocably broken. It is that the individual is powerless to do anything about it. So we see it on social media, we see it in their propaganda outlets. RT stands for Russia Today. Broadcast in homes all across America, big YouTube presence, online presence. It is a propaganda arm of the Russian government. They've had to register as a foreign agent. They have a weekly program called America's Lawyer. It's hosted by a Pensacola trial attorney named Mike Papantonio. And the message, unrelenting every week, is the justice system is irrevocably broken. Here is a typical start to a program. This is from one of the programs, but it is indicative of the message that's being carried. To say that the American justice system is broken would be a gross understatement. The once impartial judicial system has been taken over by corrupt politicians and corporations who have turned it into a tool for the political elite. Now you can hear narratives of some of what some of you in this room may agree with, right? But the message is it's irrevocably broken. So they are working to rob us of an informed citizenry and the engaged citizenry that we all know is so fundamentally important for our democracy. And as we looked at this, at the adversary attacks on democracy and on the justice system, and if you're interested, the report is on the justice system is called Beyond the Ballot. We said, you know what, there are all kinds of things you can do to try to counter this disinformation, prevent it, deter it, et cetera. What we decided was the most important was to build public resilience against the content of that messaging. How do we do that? Civics education, right? If the message that you're trying to counter is that the individual is powerless, that the system is irrevocably broken, then the way to counter that is to remind Americans not only is democracy under attack and must be defended, but that it is worth defending, not because it is perfect, but because it is capable of change, right? And that is, in a nutshell, that is the fundamental message that I believe civics education can and must impart. Looking to see all the points that I've missed by not having looked at my notes. So part of that is to make sure that our institutions are living up to our aspirations. So I've been engaged in working with the National Center for State Courts and the federal judiciary in training judges all across the country about the nature of this threat and the things they need to do to shore up public faith and confidence in their independence and impartiality. But we also need to teach Americans. Focus group on independent and impartial judges, justice system. The members of the focus group said, stop talking about independent. We don't want an independent judiciary. Because to them, it conjured up a runaway court. So reminding people why is it important to have an independent and impartial justice system? So I've been working with iCivics. I've been working with the Civic Renewal Network to help folks understand why this is a threat to our national security, the loss of legitimacy of elections and of our courts, which threatens the peaceful transition of power, the divisiveness, which makes it harder to mobilize to meet the challenges that we face today. Russian military strategy talks about destroying the internal coherence of the adversary. Right? This notion of that democracy is chaotic, that it is dysfunctional, that it is hypocritical, right? Those are all the narratives that they're pushing. And then this notion of despair, so that you either disengage or you take to the streets in violence, right? Rather than peaceful protest. So I have engaged in the last year and a half in a program called Civics as a National Security Imperative. A wonderful series of programs and fireside chats with folks like Christopher Wray and Bob Gates. Our first program was on the national security threat imposed by failure to address racial justice issues and how civics can address that, right? But then we went on to have retired generals who came to talk about civics as a national security imperative. Justices Sotomayor and Neil Gorsuch together, modeling civil discourse between two people who passionately disagree about some very fundamental things, but who have a mutual respect that allows them to have civil discourse. So that's been a big part of what we're doing. And now we're working with iCivics and the Civics Renewal Network to push for reinvigorating civics education at the K through 12 level. Very much a fan of the Educating for American Democracy roadmap and their emphasis on teaching skills, which we've talked about here at this conference. But we are also looking at, when we look at the state of civics in our country and the decades of decline in civics education, and the fact that it is a national security imperative, what that says to us is there is an urgency. We must engage in that long-term investment in K through 12 to empower individuals to understand that if the promise of democracy is not its current perfection, which doesn't exist, but its potential for change, to empower them to be the agents of that change, because that's the only way that's going to happen, that promise will be fulfilled. And that requires that you understand how our government is set up. Basic fundamentals. The three branches of government. What are they? Why do we have three branches? What are our aspirations for those branches and for those entities? And how do I, as an individual, hold them accountable and bring about change? We need to teach that. It isn't something that is just genetically passed from generation to generation, and we have neglected it. Do you know that the federal government today spends, on average, $54 per student? The federal government. $54 per student on STEM education. And do you know how much they spend on civics? 5 cents. 5 cents per student on civics education. And then we wonder why we are experiencing such a crisis in confidence and understanding about democracy. Why 3/4 of young people don't think it's particularly important to live in a democracy, right? How can we hope to sustain our democracy if we aren't teaching it? So the urgency of this and the lack of civics education over the decades means we've got to reach the adult population. It's not enough to make the long-term investment. And so we are launching now a project called Civics at Work. We believe that businesses have a vested interest in democracy and sustaining democracy. It's important. The trust in the justice system is vital for commerce. The idea of civil discourse and a robust marketplace of ideas that can only exist if you've got some sort of civic discourse is fundamental to the kind of innovation that business needs, right? All kinds of reasons there's a business case here, and businesses are a great place to scale outreach to the adult population. So what we're doing is we're signing up CEOs. You will be the first to sort of publicly know that we've got Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, on board and helping us from the get-go. But we want to sign up CEOs to come on board who will commit to being vigorous advocates for reinvigorating civics education K through 12, but also commit to have civics conversations with their own workforces, and then to support civics activities in their communities where they have a presence. So imagine a company like a Home Depot all across the country, workers filing into that training room or that cafeteria lunchroom to talk about civics, right? We need to do this. And so what I would ask of you all, and the reason that I came to this conference to listen to you, is to help us think through what is that content, right? It's easy to say we need to teach civics. I'm imagining we have an adult population that maybe we'll get to them twice a year, Law Day, Constitution Day. Maybe a company will do a little bit more than that, but not a lot of time. What is the most important thing for them to learn? I have my own thoughts on that, not surprisingly. I think you have to start any conversation like this with civil discourse, right? Some lessons on civil discourse. How do we have these conversations even around civics if we don't start with that? But I think we have to reinforce basic shared values, I think, like self-governance and fidelity to the rule of law, civil discourse, civic engagement. And then those skills would be honed in the context of a conversation around those 3 branches, how they work, how we hold them accountable, and an understanding of federalism, right? That the role of local and state governments as well. I would be satisfied with a discussion around the preamble, the first few words of the preamble of the Constitution. We the people, self-governance. We can't have self-governance if you don't understand the fundamental principles on which our government is founded and how it's set up. We the people, that notion of self-governance, civic responsibility, right? And then in order to form a more perfect union. If you're unhappy with the way things are in this country, learn how the system works. Be empowered to be an effective agent of change. We are all framers. Michael Bennett has put out a wonderful book on disinformation with lots of examples, and at the end he has a great, the senator, Michael Bennett, has a great discussion about all of the framers. It's not just those who wrote it. It's those who continue to write it, to write our narrative, to write our story, right? That we are all framers. We are the government. I think one of the most important things we need to convey is aspirations. That's the key. To me, it's all about, we don't have to agree on much. If we could agree on what our aspirations are, that would be huge, so that we can come together then to find ways to move toward those. I will close with something that struck me a number of years ago, that the national anthem that we sing starts with a question and ends with a question. And I'm on a crusade to get every stadium and every sports arena in this country to make sure they put that question mark at the end, right? Starts with, can you see the flag? Oh, say, can you see? Is the flag still there, right? We saw it through the night when the battle was raging, right? The rockets would go off and we could see it was still there, but the battle ended, and now the sun is coming up, and we're not sure. We're not sure. It ends with, does the flag still fly over the land of the free and the home of the brave? Is it still there? Is our republic still there? Is it that kind of country? And I believe that is a challenge to each and every one of us every single day. We have to be the ones who make sure that the answer to that question is yes. So, thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for those remarks. I want to start with an observation about the two of you and about our audience here on a Saturday, and then pose my first question. So I'm just delighted to see the range of people here, faculty from our school here on a Saturday and our students, but members of the community. We still have Anna Tovar from the Arizona Corporation Commission on our Board of Counselors Advisors, has been here for every session. So delighted. But members of the business community are here, at least one faculty member from other departments. So this interest in keeping the Republic, sustaining. So I sent you some questions in advance. I'm gonna skip to the first question that I mentioned to you, drawing on each of your remarks. As people who are not in higher education, that's the sort of the strength that we need, right, as educators here, to think, what is our role in higher education in rebuilding this ecosystem for civic resilience, for civic agency. Could each of you talk a little bit more about what you're doing in your work, largely outside universities, what we can do here in universities to address the challenge of trying to emphasize a common American view of the civic, of American civic education, not a conservative one or a liberal progressive one, a civic education toward a common citizenship and common agency. What particular challenges do you see, and what approaches are you trying to take in the different kinds of work that you're doing? Maybe Ian, if you want to.
Well, I guess if I were advising higher education, I mean, the challenges I see in many universities is that they're acting almost in the exact opposite of common humanity. The sort of stratification by race, by gender, by identity politics, the continuous forced separation, where you'll have professional development, of teachers, where the white teachers go into that room because they're the inherent oppressors, and they have to have a struggle session to deal with their inherent oppressive nature, and then all the non-white teachers. So I think those kind of practices should end. I mean, there's something called the privilege walk that's been occurring. I think it's happening in higher ed, but certainly in K-12, where imagine a room like this, where everyone is lined up horizontally, and a teacher at the front of the room says, if you're white, take 3 steps forward. If you're black, take 5 steps backward. And there's a series of questions where by the end of the exercise, predominantly white men stand in front of the line, and all these typically female people of color are in the back, because it's obvious you're inherently disadvantaged. And it's this and not taking into account any other factors that really drive what it means to be a human being. So I think those kind of practices need to come to an end. I will, because I run schools K to 12, I will say though that that's where much of the work has to be done in order to lay the groundwork for effective higher education. And frankly, and part of the reason I do so much work in family formation, even K to 12, by the time a kid is 5 years old, a lot has happened in their life that has either prepared them to function well within school. Do they have access to strong vocabulary, nutrition? Are they acclimated to a school environment? So there's a lot that needs to happen. I can talk about that as well before even K to 12, in terms of putting kids on a pathway to a strong civic identity in our country.
So I think one of the most important things is for schools of education to teach teachers how to teach civics. We don't have that. We really, and in so many schools, social studies, which is the closest thing that most schools have to anything like civics, it's often the gym teacher is recruited to teach, I mean, we have some wonderful, incredibly skilled and talented social studies teachers all across this country. Don't get me wrong. But it is not emphasized as we teach our teachers. So start by teaching our teachers how to teach civics. And part of that has to be, I think, understanding trauma-informed approaches, right? That you've got to pick people up where they are, that a lot of these teachers are going to be teaching a classroom full of people who have a very different relationship to government. They may be immigrants for whom government and authority figures are just a source of insecurity, not security, right? Distrust. So I really do think we've got to help teachers understand how to pick people up where they are and move them to where we want them to be, right? So that's part of it. And then, understand these fundamental principles. And then you said this last night, Paul, and I think it's true. Higher education has to fill the gap that isn't being filled in high schools. You've got to teach civics. And you've got to teach the nuts and bolts of it. It's wonderful to have the kinds of conversations that took place in this room yesterday and this morning about the deep philosophical debates. But we've got to teach nuts and bolts to our population. And when I talk about teaching adults, I'm talking about college students, right? Again, the three branches, federalism, just some basic nuts and bolts around civics. And then how do skills bring that to life? So and you've got to do this, Paul, you're the expert on this, Educating for American Democracy as a co-author. But the notion that you've got to do it in an engaging way, an engaged way in which you are training students in the skills they need, in those civic skills and civic virtues, even as you're imparting the content, right? So things like mock congresses and going and visiting a courtroom and doing mock trials and those sorts of things. Finally, I would say all across the university, think about how civics should inform your work. Brad Smith, who I interviewed as part of our project, talked very eloquently from Microsoft about why he wants his employees to have civics training and have a sense of civic responsibility. Every employee aware of the role that technology plays in our world and the impact you can have. My real area of expertise is not civics. It is cybersecurity. And in cybersecurity, I would go around the country when I was at DHS and I would talk to people and I would say, cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. And I got a lot of blank looks, like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I realized we have not instilled a sense of civic responsibility. You need to care about something other than yourself, right? So teaching those, fundamentals. So as you're teaching computer science and you're training our next innovators for the Internet of Things, talk to them about civic responsibility, that they need to be thinking about the impact of what they're doing and building in security and not allowing medical devices that are insecure to be implanted in individuals, right? So that sense of civic responsibility cuts across schools.
One quick point to reaffirm this point about the training of our education professors who are training the next generation. I debated a Brandeis professor on C-SPAN around critical race theory. We had a very good discussion, and but a caller calls in and quotes from Thomas Sowell to make a point about independence and the history of black people, self-sufficiency, and the Brandeis professor says, "Who's Thomas Sowell?" Right? It hit me like a... And I just thought, how is it possible that she's an expert on critical race theory, has never even heard of one of the most prominent economists who just happens to be black. He's not a black economist, right? He's one of the most prominent, and more than just an economist. And so this idea of viewpoint diversity, so in higher education, again, it seems like there's almost this ideological certainty about the way the world works, and thus this ideological exclusion of people that possibly could disagree with that worldview. And again, this isn't just in higher education. My own children, we just had Black History Month. And Camille, I think, made a reference to that yesterday, whether or not what we think about the utility of Black History Month. But, in my kids' elementary school, there was the books that were supposed to be read. Almost all of them were these woe is me, woe is black people set of books. Nothing from Thomas Sowell, or I think maybe one book by Booker T. Washington. Again, there just seems to be this ideological certainty and ideological exclusion of folks who might have the audacity to disagree.
Let me follow up by taking a cue, the report that Suzanne has mentioned a few times, Educating for American Democracy, does make the argument, drawing on each of your areas of expertise and of practice, that American educators, and in a way the leaders we would expect to be thinking about education for citizenship, have taken for granted civic education. It's getting done. And there have been more urgent things. Sputnik in the 1950s in the Cold War. We got to focus on STEM education, and we're in a technological race with a global adversary. Racial injustice, economic inequality. We got to focus on those questions at higher education and what's going on in schools. In the 1980s, the competitiveness crisis. We've rebuilt the West German economy. We've rebuilt the Japanese economy, South Korea, and now they're kicking our butts. And we got to focus, in schools through higher education. We got to focus on that. And then my co-authors and I noticed, by the end of all of that 50, 60 years of focus on other urgent issues, at the end of it, you don't have the sense of civic identity, civic responsibility, shared common principles, civic friendship, to have the whole free Republican economic order operate. So just work with that in each of your areas of focus now, how to reweave civics into other topics that grab more attention. But also just to say front and center, I'm sorry, more time is going to have to be carved out.
Yeah.
More resources will have to be carved out. K-12, broader, adult education. If you just, your thoughts on that.
Well, from my perspective, these things are not at cross purposes, a focus on civics and a focus on things like racial justice or other issues, because in fact, if you're talking about civics from a historical perspective, there's much to learn from what has transpired in the past to apply it to present day. So in the early part of this century, Booker T. Washington, in Jim Crow era where, black people, black kids had horrific schooling conditions. It was segregated. And again, Booker T. Washington said, I can't wait for some magical white person to show up and suddenly change school education. Although what he said is, I can build allies, and he partnered with Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the CEO of the Sears Roebuck Company, and they built this amazing, he had an idea, Booker T. Washington had an idea to create a network of amazing schools exclusively focused on black kids, and they built nearly 5,000 schools in the heart of the South, in Jim Crow segregation. And the results were incredible in terms of academic achievement. And the money was matched by local communities who raised money, who had a huge amount of ownership over these schools. It's an incredible example of Black self-sufficiency, and it's not, again, the lessons learned for many of these are universal, it just happen to be executed by Black people, but the idea is if a group of people could achieve that then, why couldn't we achieve that now, and what were the lessons to be learned? And ironically, many people in K-12 education have never even heard of the Rosenwald schools, this experiment. And another piece of history is the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, which is often viewed as the holy grail, the greatest achievement, one of the great decisions, actually was the impetus for the demise of the Rosenwald schools, because separate was defined as unequal and inherently inferior. So here are these all-Black schools that were outperforming, they were doing incredible work, that now were deemed unconstitutional. These are important lessons to be learned about these presumptions that we have, that segregated schools must be bad or must be inferior. I run schools in the heart of the South Bronx. I can't wait for a group of white kids to show up in order to have high expectations for my kids, right? So I think there's a way to bring together history, civics, these core values of America, to apply them to present-day issues. They are not at cross purposes.
And then you have a we would call it a STEM background. I mean, that was your work at
Right. I mean, my own story is crazy. Well, yeah, in high school, I went to Brooklyn Tech, and you had to choose a major. I was an electrical engineer in high school. That somehow put me on this crazy path. But yeah, these are not. When people say those things, we can't focus on civics because we've got to focus on racial justice. That's a red herring. And shame on us for accepting that argument.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I guess I haven't heard that argument, but I think we can focus on STEM and need to, and have to focus on civics. And they are both absolutely essential to our national security, which obviously is my passion and my perspective on this. So the good news, I think, is, the bad news, of course, is all the survey results, and you're all familiar with them. And that in the last National Assessment of Educational, the National Education Assessment, only 1/4 of 8th graders were proficient in civics. 1/4. The 43% of voters nationwide at least somewhat agreed that the Constitution made sense in the 18th century, but is irrelevant in the 21st century, right? And then, of course, the most troubling survey results that we've seen recently of a third of Americans surveyed believe that violence against the government can at times be justified. It shows you how far off the path we can actually get if we despair and give up in the efficacy of the system. The good news is that there's bipartisan support for this. There is, as I know you know, in the House and the Senate, with a Republican and Democratic sponsor in both the House and the Senate, the Civics Secures Democracy Act, which has bipartisan support, which is a major investment in civics education and all kinds of provisions that create an institutional structure to support the reinvigoration of civics education. Frank Lutz, who's a Republican pollster, did a survey in which he asked the folks being surveyed across the country what would be the most effective way of restoring a sense of national identity, and gave them lots of choices, including civic engagement. But the one that got overwhelming, bipartisan, equal number of Democrats and Republicans. When's the last time you saw a survey that had equal number of Democrats and Republicans? Said civics education was the most effective way, the most important thing that we can do. I serve on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, a commission that Congress established to develop a strategy for doing better in a job in cybersecurity. What does that have to do with civics? But we had recommendations to reinvigorate civics education. I talked a bit about the role of civic responsibility, but also cyber and disinformation, and they did a white paper on this. Bipartisan. Congressman Mike Gallagher, Republican from Wisconsin, and Angus King, who caucuses with the Democrats, leadership. The Commission on Public Service did not expect to get into civics. But as they did their work on how do we get people to engage in military and public service, they said, if we don't teach civics education, we're never going to instill that sense that drives people to public service. And so their first sets of recommendations around civics education. That's my sense of hope around this, is that I think this is actually one issue where at a high level, we can come together to reinvigorate civics. The details of the content are things that should be set at the local and state level. And I think EAD reached the same conclusion.
Yes, great. Thank you. So we have a microphone here in the middle. We have almost 25, a little over 20 minutes for questions. As people are coming up, I'll just make a note that this has been a very long set of concerns for American founders and framers. Washington's farewell address in 1796 addresses the fact that we have economic prosperity, but he's worried, do we have the civic virtues to operate government? And well, he's worried about foreign interference, partly because of a lack of civic virtue and civic friendship, exploiting partisan divisions. There's not a passage about the internet, I don't think. But other than that, very long.
You could read it in there, I'm sure.
Very long-standing concerns. Okay, first question.
Thank you so much for coming. I grew up in a very small town in Colorado where many of the kids I graduated with were already married, and many had already had kids of their own. It was more normal to go straight to work instead of college. For the few of us, there were about 20 who did go to college, only about 10 of us remain in school. My question is, how can we encourage civic involvement and responsibility in a community like mine, where a majority of the people are no longer in schools? They don't have that kind of conversation anymore. And all they want to do is grow up and stay in this bubble. Thank you.
Great question. Let me answer that in two ways. From the school perspective, so one of the reasons I'm launching Vertex Partnership Academies is that it's an international baccalaureate school, where four-year high school program. But at 11th grade, when you graduate from, when you complete your second year, your sophomore year, you'll get to choose whether or not you want to pursue the International Baccalaureate Diploma program, which is a more traditional college pathway, or choose the International Baccalaureate Careers model. And so initially we'll have 4 different career paths. We'll have healthcare, computer science, technology, construction/architecture, and something in media. We still haven't decided yet. So we're in discussions, for example, with the Mayo College to have a course of study on phlebotomy, so that in high school you can study to become a phlebotomist. So at the end of 4 years, you can graduate and become a phlebotomist and earn $125 an hour if that's what you so choose. So I think the college for all mentality that I used to have as a leader in elementary and middle school, now running high schools, I just recognize you've got to create more pathways. And I think the reason I run schools is that I think sometimes it's difficult for people to actually visualize what it is that you're talking about when you say like multiple pathways. So I think we need to build institutions that give young people like that a choice. So that's one of the things I'm doing in that front. The other issue you're raising about kids having children and already married, that's a very real thing. I mean, in the communities I serve, and like in many communities across the country, younger kids are still having children. They're not necessarily married. In fact, one of the big things that shifted my thinking about all of this was in 2016. I had been running my network of charter schools for 6 years at that point. We had been headquartered in Tribeca, which is a very cool part of Manhattan, but all of our growth was clearly going to be in the South Bronx because the level of need of high quality schools was extremely high. So we moved our headquarters from Tribeca, where I say you can get a latte on every corner, to 149th Street and 3rd Avenue, where there literally was a needle exchange on the corner. But the point was, this is where our kids were, and they have aspirations for great things for their kids. So we took our staff on a walking tour of the neighborhood just so they can get to a sense of where's the local deli, where's the local bank. And as we were walking, we saw this 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck with all of these people around it who were very excited. Like, oh my God, it was like literally, it was like the ice cream truck, you know, with kids, but all these adults. And as we got closer, we saw that there was graffiti lettering on the side. And the lettering said, "Who's your daddy?" Like, what is that? And as I investigated more, it turned out that the Who's Your Daddy truck that was so well known was a mobile DNA testing center, where low-income folks were spending somewhere between $350 to $500 to get DNA tests to answer questions such as, are you my sister? Could you be my father? Like fundamental questions about identity. And I learned that the non-marital birth rate in that community was about 85%. And the more and more I studied urban areas, rural areas, I started to discover the non-marital birth rates, particularly the women 24 and under, were skyrocketing. And it's one of the reasons we talk about civics a lot. We kind of leap over the first and most important civic institution, which is the strength and stability of the family in which you're born or raised. And so I think that now needs to be a more explicit part of a K-12 education, and other social institutions, that's why I have the free framework, have to reinforce this message that how you form family, particularly having children, is crucial to your success and the long-term success of your children.
Okay. Next question.
Secretary Spalding, Mr. Rowe, thank you both so much. Really wonderful to hear your perspectives, and I'm so excited, Mr. Rowe, to hear about the schools that are starting. I wonder if there'll be one in Denver in about 6 months. But maybe we can talk
6
about
months?
later.
Wow, not 6 months.
That's my timeline for getting to Denver. If it takes you a couple of years, it's
Yep.
that out of the way. I want to excuse myself if I come off as a little prickly in these questions. I've spent the last 13 years as a high school teacher, and so when we talk about civics education, my focus is on the word education, what kind of relationship it is I'm developing with my students, the kind of trust I'm asking of them, and the kind of things that I need to give them to make sure I'm fulfilling my obligation. I heard you say, Secretary Spalding, that teachers have a responsibility to pick people up, meet them where they are. And I strongly agree with that as a philosophic notion of what pedagogy is. But then you said we've got to move them toward thinking about the government and authority as being comforting, as being helpful, a source of security rather than insecurity. And you gave the example of an immigrant student. Now I'm thinking about this from my perspective as a teacher. And when a student comes to me and says, I heard a senator say that immigrants are lazy and aren't supposed to be in this country, and that my presence here is a crime, I struggle to understand what my responsibility is to the student in the face of that kind of top-down problem. Why should I be fighting my students' experience to believe that government is there for them when the rhetoric that they hear is that in reality, the people who get elected to government and the words that they choose to say publicly reflect not a civic inclusivity, but an exclusion? Do I still have the responsibility to deny that reality?
Okay, so that, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you
Thank you, Jeff.
so much for that question. It's an excellent point, and it's an opportunity for me to clarify, because again, as I tried to say repeatedly, I think what we are trying to instill is an appreciation for how the system, how the democracy has the potential to change. Right? That's the aspiration. That's what I want to give people a sense of hope about. Not any sense that government is perfect, that our elected officials, for God's sake, are perfect, but that if they see something like that that they want to change, how to empower them to bring about that change, right? That doesn't mean they give up on America or that they give up on democracy. It means that what we're trying to instill is a sense that you can have agency, as was talked about earlier today. You can be empowered to bring about change, to hold institutions accountable, that's what elections are about, that's what all kinds of accountability boards, inspectors general. I mean, I would love Americans to have a better sense of the notion of inspectors general in the executive branch. Individuals and offices that are supposed to have independence to hold accountable departments and agencies all across the government. Why is that important for Americans to know? So that when they see inspectors general being fired, they have, some sense that that's maybe problematic, something they need to look into, right? So it's not that teachers should say, don't worry about that, right? It is perhaps, how does that make you feel? Do you think that's right? What does that make you? What does that tell you about the importance of elections? And what are the ways you could get involved, right? To make sure that we are. And so, what is your aspiration for the people who hold those offices? What do you want in those individuals? Now, how are you going to take some action to make that happen? I talk to a lot of young people. I'm on the board of a wonderful organization called Girls Security, and they go into high schools and talk to young girls about national security, trying to diversify our pipeline, but also help girls, women, to be more effective citizens around national security issues. And so I talk to a lot of young girls, and I often hear, this isn't my constitution. The system doesn't work for me. Why should I believe in it, right? And you have to tell stories about individuals who have been able to bring about change, but you also have to empower them. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen quickly.
And let me just quickly say, because I'm starting high school, so I don't know if that was a hypothetical, because I'd actually love to know what you actually did say to the student. I mean, if I were running a high school, which I will be shortly, there's power in the single story, right? Sometimes a particular story of an individual can be universal, inspiring, and have lessons for all of us to learn. But then also, the power of a single story can be very dangerous if you take a single incident and make the assumption that applies to the entirety of the institution that you're talking about. So I think I'd be very careful not to, just because this student heard that, to affirm this belief that every single senator believes what they heard from this one individual, and to dive deeper. Doesn't mean that it's not true or they didn't experience it, but don't accept that the single story in this case is universal, and dive deeper. And are there contrasts? I mean, yeah, if the Constitution is not for me, then read the words of Frederick Douglass, read the words of Martin Luther King, how they speak about these documents. There has to be a contrasting viewpoint to help a young person work through their own belief on that issue.
And thank you for doing what you do.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
My question for the both of you is I would like to hear a rebuke to the notion that, because both of you seem to entail using capital and capitalists as part of your solution. You emphasize the E in entrepreneurship, and yourself were very proud to have your partnership with Microsoft, but isn't the kind of capitalism and the market itself one of the issues that has partially caused this? This was brought up in some of the panels yesterday, that markets kind of have this caustic effect on public morality. De Tocqueville talks about this as well. So wouldn't you think that's a part of the issue? I can certainly see the Microsofts would love to sell you on this notion that they're here, where they'll then turn around and give the Chinese whatever they want to keep access to that market. The capital system might even be able to create a group of virtuous individuals, but the incentive structure I don't think is really there to maintain it in the long run. So what would you have to say counter that?
Yeah. So the final E in free is entrepreneurship. And while it does encompass the building of capital, launching businesses, it's much more about having an entrepreneurial mindset, being a problem solver. America, as I talked about before, is this associative culture where we see problems and we come together to solve them. And I think more and more young people need to understand that entrepreneurship is another tool of agency. It's about solving problems. As it relates to capitalism, are there excesses of capitalism? Sure. But is the very fact that we're sitting in this room live streaming to how many people, the standard of living that every single person has in this country attributable to the economic form of management, which is capitalism? Absolutely. So there do have to be reasonable constraints, but I certainly wouldn't, there are people who literally believe that capitalism is evil. In my view, they're wrong. So there's a moral imperative for those of us that believe in capitalism to show the merits of it while acknowledging the constraints, the negative externalities that have happened in society. But I wouldn't accept the premise that capitalism itself is a purely evil. You may not be saying that, but is a purely evil enterprise.
But I think you're right that the excesses, the inequities that capitalism often produces have contributed to the lack of faith in democracy. But I actually think it's because a lot of young people equate unbridled capitalism with democracy, right? And so what they're really, often in the conversations that I have, what they are really struggling against is the inequities, right, that are produced by that unbridled capitalism. And they look then at the fact that the system isn't serving them well, right? But I think it's really important to again, to see democracy as a structure and a process and a set of skills that enables you, if you understand them, to make those changes, right? And even to rein in the excesses of unbridled capitalism, if that's your aspiration, if that's what you think the change that needs to come about. So I think the problem has been the merging of the two, people thinking they're the same thing. And obviously there are democracies that are socialists.
Right. Yeah. Well, I was just going to suggest, I think when you hear that concern, you should also ask, well, what's your compelling and empowering alternative to this form of economic management that has existed? Because there's a lot of evidence that when you do look at more socialist societies, there has simply not been the level of innovation, racial justice, social justice, the rule of law. So I think it'd be important to force whomever is making that argument to say, what is the compelling alternative?
Okay, thank you. We're going to go into the rapid round. Maybe some briefer questions and briefer answers if we can. Yeah.
Okay. So in speaking on personal histories, I spent 6 years of my education, from 7th grade to my senior year, at Anthem Preparatory Academy, a member school of the Grey Herd Academies, a liberal arts program. I personally count my time there as highly formative, beneficial, and necessary both to my and to the public good. A number of my peers, however, disagreed. They remained disengaged from the material, were critical of the utility of our education and the Western canon at large, and rejected the lessons that the program had worked to impart. My question then is this: how do we overcome the disbelief in liberal or civic education? How can we better ensure this education benefits those resistant to it? Can liberal education benefit the greater public rather than some rare individuals, so long as these views persist?
Well, good question. I mean, I'd love to talk to you to why you think the education that you received at Great Hearts was so useful, and then I'd love to also talk to that group of students who you feel that it wasn't. And just the whole idea is that none of this stuff should be so permanent that you never entertain ideas on how to strengthen it. I read de Tocqueville, the essence of America is that we are not exceptional, we're exceptional in recognizing and improving our faults. So I'd love to see the canon, Is Thomas Sowell in there? I might argue that if he's not, then he should, Are there other, so I think hopefully the answer you receive to that question is an openness to look at the education that you and your colleagues receive to see if there are ways to improve it.
Okay, next. Thank you.
Hi. Actually, I grew up with Parker at Anthem Prep as well, and it was a great experience for me too. And they sort of gave me like a little starter pack. Here's some Aristotle, here's some Plato. We're going to get the process started for you. Contemplate what does it mean to be a citizen, what does it mean to be human. But it was a little bit isolating, and when I went out into the world, I didn't know until I met Professor Beinenberg here at SCETL the importance of even state government. And I wasn't aware at all about how systems work. How do we actually implement the change? And so the content of civic education, should it concern the theory of what does it mean to be a citizen, as well as just giving them basic structure information? This is the system we live in, and somewhat combining the two.
Absolutely. I think we have to, and I think it goes to part of how to make that education valuable, right? It's not just imparting, it has to impart facts and knowledge, but it's not just imparting facts and knowledge. It is building those civic virtues and skills, curiosity, which is one of our speakers earlier in the conference talked about. And so those are the things that are really going to stick with you. Some of the facts that you learn will stick with you and will come in handy, but they have to be. And that's why I think these teachers that do mock congresses, that do mock trials, that sort of let you, one of the exercises they actually do at one of our national defense universities is they have these adults in this room take on the roles of the framers of the Constitution and work through issues. It is that experiential learning that we're getting smarter about, I think, in our education.
And the last E is for entrepreneurship. So if you see a problem like that, like Kaya Henderson, who used to run the schools in Washington, D.C., was frustrated by what she thought was a lack of historical education in the African-American experience. She's created a company called Reconstruction, which now has been utilized by homeschoolers and parents across the country who are supplementing what they don't think that they're seeing. Same thing has been done in the Jewish community. So I think we have to see ourselves as problem-solving people, that the solution may not come to your question from someone else. You have it within you to be the problem solver. And I think, again, that's one of the reasons I think free is a concept I'm hoping can be embraced, to recognize the world is not always going to go your way, regardless of race, class, gender, blah, 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 but you have the ability to create solutions too.
Thank you. Ben?
So I teach in a biology department, and you've been talking about STEM a little bit. STEM education entails civics education, often thoughtlessly, tacitly, about what society's problems are and what count as solutions to them, about what form governance should take, and so forth. And for reasons that I think emerged alongside the moments that Paul was pointing to. So concern about science literacy and public understanding of science emerges in the following Sputnik and so forth as a kind of national security concern, where the idea is we need buy-in to this enterprise for the strength of the country. And there's something similar in what you guys have said, a kind of civics literacy. That has not only failed as a project, it has produced a kind of backlash against what it sought to achieve, precisely because the dimensions of what is sort of contested in public life together get occluded and treated as matters of sort of textbook knowledge. So I'm wondering if you'd say something about the nuts and bolts and the ways in which those nuts and bolts can be achieved, can be approached to avoid that kind of problem, especially if the content is treated as a sort of matter of subsidiarity to be left to the local level of curriculum design.
Yep. So as someone who runs schools in 2010 in New York State, every year there are these state standardized tests. In 2010, the chancellor decided to eliminate the social studies state test. And at some other point, they'd eliminated the science test. And this is not an argument for standardized tests in those subject matters, but the effect of that in elementary school is that you saw this slow erosion of the presence of science and social studies in the actual day-to-day curriculum. In our schools, we had science 5 days a week and social studies 5 days a week. In most elementary schools, you now might have science 40 or 50 minutes once per week, and social studies maybe twice per week. So literally, just from a very pragmatic perspective, the level of exposure that kids in most elementary schools across the country, I mean, take a look at it, are getting very little exposure to science and social studies, which, and by the way, now that time has been filled by ELA classes, which is all about sort of content-free, what's the main idea, like not content that is designed to build knowledge. It's about reading skills versus building knowledge, or we could talk a lot about the science of reading. But just, if this is an area of focus for you, particularly, and if higher education wants to have an impact on what's happening in K-12, look at the time spent on science and social studies, especially in the early grades across the country, and how that has shifted over the last 20 years.
Okay. Suzanne, just a brief, do you have anything on?
Yeah, and again, I think when time is squeezed, which is what Ian's talking about, you resort to imparting facts, right? The idea of having a mock Congress, that takes time. That takes a big chunk of the school day. And if time is squeezed, you're going to lose, you're going to go back to this dusty, book, just imparting facts, as opposed to breathing life into those facts and helping people understand how the facts relate to the skills that you're teaching.
Quick
Karen,
solution.
yeah.
So the first question, I'd wonder particularly, Mr. Rowe, your viewpoint on, in terms of access to education and education being a pillar of your agenda, how then should we not see, or how do you see cancellation of student debt and student debt fitting into that? We promise kids, particularly students who are non-white, that if they want a better life, go get an education, but yes, be willing to take out crushing amounts of loans to be able to do that, for which that financial decision impacts the rest of their lives and the decisions that they make in terms of choosing to marry, choosing to raise a family. So I wonder how you think about that. And also just a very quick interjection. We've talked a lot about books and about the this kind of, I think, wrong assumption that the only thing for books in schools teaching about the Black experience is about pain and trauma, and I think there's a lot to be discussed about a publishing industry, which is largely white, only wanting to produce and satisfy a certain desire for only Black trauma. I think a lot of what the push is happening for is to merely just have more options to censor the Black experience. We look at Black Panther and the runaway success, which wasn't about these issues. So I think it's important to understand that it's not just about trying to make Black kids feel bad, but it's about the range of experience. If I was able to read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich in school and empathize with that and a range of experiences, I just think it's really important to understand that there are people who are fighting to read about Black and brown joy, marriage, trivialities, mediocrity. Right. So thank you so much.
No, I love it. I 100% agree with that whole stanza. Yes, I hope and pray for a much broader diversity of what is considered Black literature. In terms of the first question about debt cancellation, so on the surface, I mean, who would be against the idea of canceling student debt? My issue, though, with it generally is that most of the plans that I see, when you look at the actual details, the effect of it will typically go to benefit middle and upper class college kids and white kids predominantly. Like if your interest is how to have debt cancellation really support low-income Black kids, most of the analysis has been done. Like, for example, when Joe Biden has been proposing to just lop off $50,000 of debt, far more of that benefit will go to middle-class kids. And so I just think when we talk about these things, we just have to be honest about who it actually helps. I just did a debate on the New York Times on race-based affirmative action. And I'm arguing that I think class-based affirmative action is probably much more reasonable now, because when you look at actually in most elite schools, black kids that are being accepted are almost always, 70% are middle and upper class kids. They're recent immigrants, they're strong families. I don't think that's who race-based affirmative action was originally designed. So I think we just have to dig down into the surface of how these things actually play out to come to the final conclusion.
Okay, thank you. We are over time, so just maybe each question, let's take these two questions both briefly, if you could, and then.
Sure. So I guess mine is more of a provocation anyway. So in Revolt of the Elites, Christopher Lasch argued that at least part of the reason you see this kind of doom, hopelessness kind of narratives from elites is that it's actually convenient in a way to portray things as hopeless, because it means that people in the elite class don't have any responsibility. They don't have any they can exploit, to capitalize on the system, enjoy the fruits of being at the top, but not have to owe anything to this system if it's fundamentally corrupt and racist and irretrievably so. I guess what I'm wondering is, to what extent do you think that at least part of the problem is the fact that for a lot of people in the elite class, there's actually kind of a genuine interest, for them to kind of have this kind of doomy attitude, and then what do you propose to do about that?
Okay. So let's just take the second question as well, and then we'll see how the two of you want to. Yes, please.
I don't have a question. I have an expression of gratitude for being here, and I want to share what may be a non sequitur. But it's a little bit of wisdom that I learned from my Air Force ROTC instructor many years ago at George Washington University. He happened to be William Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist. And when he was leaving the Air Force many years later, he wrote something else, and this is what I want to share. He said, "One hair doesn't make a beard." Thank you.
One hair doesn't make a beard. We're going to ponder that. Thank you very much for being here. This part of what we try to do is have members of the community, a whole range of people. So, got another comment on that, or on the on Musa's question?
I'm sure there's depth in one hair does not make a beard, so I'm going to seek you out to become more learned on what that means. In terms of the question about quote-unquote elites and painting this doom and gloom, it's the fundamental issue. As relates to issues of race, black people who've been successful, who've afforded, have reaped the benefits of capitalism, of good education, strong marriages, faith commitment. I mean, there was a study done a few years ago about black men making it in America, and the script is pretty much the same. Education, work, marriage, children. Usually they had a faith commitment, sometimes military. They had a belief in agency and their own ability. The fundamental thing is people who've been successful have to have the courage to preach what you have practiced in your own life. That's it. That's what has to happen. It's not the system's corrupt, I was the exception. No, let me help you understand the institutions that I became part of that allowed me to propel myself. It's fundamental.
Okay. Suzanne, do you?
So I would interpret the quote to be a reference to the importance of civic friendship, going back to our earlier panel. But I've talked a lot about empowering individuals, but part of that is empowering individuals to come together to make a change. I have no doubt that there are elites who find certainly cynicism, skepticism can be very fashionable, and I find it incredibly frustrating. But I have to say, I am inspired by the number of middle class, upper middle class, well-educated people that I encounter and work with every single day who are hopeful, who are optimists, who look at the huge challenges we face today, who read these survey results, who look at what's happening in Ukraine today, but who manage to have hope. And that's why they do what they do every day. It's why I think so many of you do what you do every day, because you believe you can make a difference. If you believe you can make a difference, then you have hope, And that's what I see more than the idea that doom, being a doomsayer absolves us of responsibility. And I am so inspired by so many young people today who want to change the world, right? They want to change the world. Survey after survey says, young people, they don't just want to do a job, they want to change the world. So, I'm a glass half full kind of person. Maybe that's a good place to close.
Wonderful. Before we say thank you to our two panelists, a few final remarks and thanks as we finish this two-day conference. So as I mentioned yesterday, Dr. Carol McNamara is our Associate Director for Public Programs. This is the 5th of these conferences that she's planned since 2017, along with several other key staff in the school, Morgan and Marlene and Vanessa and Marcia and several others. So let's start by giving thanks to thank you to Arizona PBS. Thanks to our colleagues at Senator O'Connor College of Law who have been co-sponsoring this sub-series, Can We Talk Honestly About Race? On our website, or as you're leaving, you can find information about our range of degrees and programs, further events coming up this spring in the Civic Discourse Project. Since we talked a lot about education and schools, we have a master's degree, which is in part oriented to school teachers, a master's in classical liberal education and leadership, but much more to learn about the school. Some of you are participating in the Civic Classics Collection tour, and you can get some additional information about that outside. There's lunch outside. We did this yesterday. Our partners at ASU and the business school, we're using a sort of dean's patio for the W.P. Carey School of Business, so the box lunch is out there for grab and go. And finally, thank you to all the speakers who came from out of town, from within the Arizona community, our faculty members who served as moderators. Thanks to all of them, and thanks to these two accomplished professionals with national projects to try to achieve a common good and reweave a civic fabric, Ian Rowe and Suzanne Spalding. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.